Good afternoon, Professor Fullwood. Thank you so much for your time and for agreeing to join me today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So, to start, let me introduce you to the others. Professor Chris Fullwood is a senior lecturer at College of Psychology at Birmingham City University. His work, has primarily focused on cyberpsychology, exploring topics such as how people choose, how they want to be perceived online, like social media and dating platforms. In addition, he is one of the founding members of the British Psychological Society's cyberpsychology session, and today we will discussing the topic of online self-presentation and psychological well-being. Professor
Oh,
Fuhud, I have
very nice introduction.
several.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So I don't know whether your students will necessarily be familiar with the term cyber psychology. It's a fairly new sort of sub-discipline of psychology. It hasn't really been around for that long. Cyber psychology is just principally concerned with understanding the psychological ramifications of living in a world with different forms of digital technology. So, how do these new and emerging forms of technology, like the internet, computers, smartphones, gaming devices, how do they impact on us from a psychological perspective? So, yeah, that's really where cyber psychology comes from. And yeah, I've had a privilege of being involved in setting up the cyber psychology section for the British Psychological Society, as you mentioned, which has now been going for, I think, about 5, 6 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, and gathering some momentum. So lots of people are starting to become interested in this field of research.
that's awesome. I'm really enthusiastic about this topic, and I have several questions to do. So, to start, let me ask you the first thing that does technology affect the way people present themselves to others? Are we able to be someone different online? What do you think?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think there are individual differences in the extent to which people experiment with different ways of performing or different acting out different personas when they're in online spaces. So the technology allows us essentially to be whoever we want to be. So if I wanted to design an online presence that was a completely different individual to how I perceive myself in the offline world, the tools at my disposal will allow me to do that. So I can create a false profile on a social media platform. I can upload photographs that are not me. I can steal them from somewhere else on the internet. Um, I might even use something like AI to create a representation of myself. AI is becoming much more sophisticated for that particular purpose. I saw something interesting the other day, a news article about an individual who'd been conned out of quite large sums of money by interacting with AI created image or an AI created avatar of a person who was pretending essentially to be someone from the US military. And the technology was so convincing that the person believed it was a real person rather than an AI created video. So yeah, the technology lets you be whoever you want to be. And obviously, some people will choose to use those affordances in more nefarious ways, for example, engaging in criminal activities like cyber fraud and scamming people online. Um, Whereas for other people, it might be that they just like to use a technology to experiment with different ways of behaving to see how other people might react to that. to see what kind of reactions that they get, and whether those reactions are positive or whether they're negative, then might be incorporated into how they perceive themselves in a more general sense. So some of the research that we've conducted over the years has tried to find out if there are characteristics, individual differences that might incline someone to be more likely to experiment with kind of different types of self-presentation online, right? So one of the factors that comes up quite frequently is something called self-concept clarity. So when we think about our self-concept, what we're talking about essentially is the sort of way in which we think about ourselves, the way in which we define ourselves. Um, so that might include things like um, your perceived strengths and weaknesses, your beliefs, the values that you have, your interests, your hobbies, your personality, all of those different things that kind of wrap up together that make us who we are. That might be collectively referred to as a self-concept. All of us have a conception of self. But what we find is that people differ in terms of the clarity of that self-concept. So by clarity, what we're referring to is the extent to which that sense of self is clearly defined, and it's stable. So when we move from one situation to the next, we interact with one group and then interact with another. We don't all of a sudden change and become a different person. We might behave in different ways because we're aware that obviously the different audiences might expect different things from us. And we might behave very differently at work, say, than we would if we were out with our friends, because we try on these different masks depending upon the social situation and what we want to get out of those different situations. But some people, particularly, we find this a lot in adolescence. Some people find it harder to define who they are. So if you ask them, who are you? How would you describe yourself? Some people would find that a difficult task. They might struggle to come up with a list of adjectives that describe who they are, where some people, they would give you pages and pages and be able to very accurately and in detail describe who they are as a person. So we don't all necessarily have a clear sense of who we are, and particularly during adolescence when you're kind of finding your place in the world, that transition from childhood to adult, when it becomes adulthood, when it becomes really important to think about who are you and what is your place, and what are you going to do with your future. That's when we find that the sort of sense of self tends to be more malleable, tends to fluctuate, and tends to be less clear. So the research that we've conducted in the past, we've looked to see if there is a link between clarity of self-concepts and people's online self-presentation behavior. Now, in terms of self-presentation behavior, we developed our own scale to measure this, and we call it the presentation of online self scale. And this has four factors, four sub-dimensions associated with it. One of which is something that we call idealized self. So it's the extent to which people are inclined when they're interacting in online domains like we are now, the extent to which they're inclined to try and put across an image that's very, very positive and very idealized. So show off all of their good qualities, all of the things that they think other people are going to respond favorably to. So they accentuate the positive aspects of the self, and then they might suppress the more negative aspects of the self. And this is something that most of us do when we're on social media anyway, right? When you're on
Yes.
Facebook, or whichever social media platform you're using, you don't tend to find people talking about all of the things that went wrong with their day. Some people do, but most people tend to be more inclined to talk about the things that went well. So the job promotion that they got, or, um, you know, the fact they're in a new relationship, people tend to share details about more positive aspects of their life story. So social media inclines us to do that anyway, sort of encourages us to be more positive about the way in which we present ourselves to others. Um, but some people go a stage further and present a much more polished or idealized self-image. One of the other sub-factors that we thought was really interesting is something we call multiple selves. So this is the extent to which you change and adapt your self-presentation based upon the situation in which you find yourself. So, for example, the individuals with whom you're interacting or the context in which you're interacting with them. So some people have a more diverse kind of array of different self-presentations depending upon the space they find themselves in. Whereas other people kind of just they're the same no matter where you find them. Their personality just shines through, and it doesn't really matter. They're confident and happy with themselves, so they just tend to present a very unitary sort of self-presentation, a unitary identity that's the same no matter where they are. Um, and the third factor that we thought was really interesting was the what we call consistent self, and this is the extent to which the way in which we would behave offline mirrors how we behave online. So some people like to go online because they can be something different. And it may be, for example, because in their offline lives, they feel that they can't really be who they want to be. So this kind of notion of the true self, as Rogers calls it, the idea that we don't always get to be who we want to be because we're constrained by things like social responsibilities, or we're constrained by our own personality. So if we're really shy, we might find it hard to kind of go and talk to someone, for example. Or we might be constrained by roles within society that we have to undertake, or even things like societal structures. So there are some things that we know that we should do, we shouldn't do, and there's certain obligations and duties that we have to live up to. So, yes, some people will find it much more difficult to kind of be that person that they want to be. However, we conceptualize that as a true self or ideal self, they find it much more complicated. And those types of individuals tend to be more likely to be drawn to the online world because there are fewer constraints that are placed upon them. So they don't necessarily have to behave in those expected ways. They can be more confident. They can inhabit a more confident persona. Um, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One might be because some spaces allow you to be anonymous. One might be that there is kind of an asynchronicity in certain types of online communication. So the way we're communicating now isn't asynchronous. So as I'm speaking, you're hearing everything that I'm saying. So that's synchronous. It's in real time. But most forms of online communication are asynchronous in the sense that they don't take place in real time. So if you sent me an email, you don't know if I've picked it up straight away. And even if I have picked it up straight away, I've still got to read it before I can respond. Even something like instant messenger is not really instant because the person doesn't see the message until you've hit send. So they don't see it as you're typing it. They only see the message in its entirety once you've decided to send it. And I think that the sort of the notion behind this is that it kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility and freedom to express yourself. So you don't have to worry about being eloquent and being erudite and being able to respond on the fly because you can take your time to think about how you want to come across. You could even get your friends to have a look at the message that you're writing. So if you're sending an email to someone like your boss, for example, because you're upset at them because they didn't give you a pay raise, the first thing you do is you sort of type out an email angrily, I deserve better than this. And then you think about it and go, actually, maybe that might come across as a little bit aggressive, or maybe I can soften the wording there to make it a little less intense or what have you. So there are these features of certain areas of cyberspace that give us a little bit more control freedom, a larger degree of control over how we present ourselves to others. Yeah, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here. So, um, so back to what we were talking about originally. Self-concept clarity. What we found is that in all of the studies that we've done numerous studies with different age groups, adolescents, young adults, older adults. What we tend to find consistently is that individuals who score lower in self-concept clarity, so i.e., those people that find it harder to give a sort of a perspective on who they think they are, people that might change their mind from one day to the next about who they think they are, people that might find that they are very likely to inhabit different types of characters depending upon who they're interacting with. They're much more likely to go with the flow than have a kind of consistent sense of self that cuts across different social interactions. People who score low in that trait tend to also prefer being online. So they prefer to interact with other people online. They tend to be more likely to present an idealized image of the self online. They tend to be more likely to present multiple images of the self across different online platforms. And they tend to present a less consistent self, i.e., their offline self and their online self are less likely to be congruous, right? So there's something about your sense of your sense of how you perceive yourself that seems to interact with how you use the technology. And a part of that might be about sort of self-exploration. So you're using the technology to try out different ways of behaving, to see how they feel, to see how other people react to them, and then ultimately, to, with the aim of kind of settling on a version of the self that you're comfortable with. Some of it might be about control that, if you're people, self-concept clarity tends to be related to things like self-esteem. So people that score lower in self-concept clarity also tend to have lower self-esteem because they're not sure of who they are. They don't know what their place in the world is. So they tend to be less confident, tend to have placed less value on their own self-worth. So it might be that they're kind of using the online world as a space where they can feel happier about themselves. So if the confidence is lacking, if the self-esteem is lacking, if they go online and experiment and present themselves in a way that's more positive, more polished, more idealized, that might make them feel better about who they are. And interestingly, the research around kind of the impact of using this technology on self-esteem is mixed. And it seems to suggest it depends very much on what we use the technology for. So if we're looking at something like social media, for example, we tend to find that people will have a boost in confidence, a boost in self-esteem, if they're using social media to talk about themselves. So if someone uses, say, Facebook, I know Facebook's a bit passé now, young people don't use it anymore, but it's the example I like to use because it's a platform I still use and I grew up with. Um, if you're using Facebook to kind of give updates on your life and tell people about what you're doing, as I said earlier, most of the time that tends to be people talking about positive things, like things that have happened to them that are nice. That kind of has this impact of making the person feel good about themselves. However, the problem with that, with having a technology that encourages people to disproportionately talk about good things that's happening to them, is that if you're on the receiving end, you're the person who's scrolling through the social media feed, you're going to be seeing lots and lots of examples of people doing really well. And of course, then that creates this condition, the ideal conditions for social comparison. because most of the people that are on your Facebook feed will be your contemporaries, will be your peers. There'll be people that you can readily compare yourself to. And if they all seem to be doing better, even though actually it's a very distorted version of their lives because they're only talking about the good things and the positive things that have happened to them, you might then think as a consequence that you're not doing so well in comparison. So that might then have a negative impact on your sense of self-worth. So yeah, it's an interesting and quite dangerous mix, that you kind of might get these fluctuations in terms of your mental health, in terms of your well-being, depending on what you're using the technology for. If you're limiting your use of the technology, in the sense that you're using it mostly to tell people about your life, that will probably mean that you have a much sort of healthier outlook, than if you're mostly using the technology to scroll through and see how everyone else is doing. Um, so, the technology is, I think it's really interesting in terms of how it might interact with people's mental well-being. I'm not sure. I think I might have gone off on quite a few tangents there, but it's a topic that I'm really interested in, as you can see. Um, so I'm not sure whether I got to the heart of the question that you're asking, but hopefully some of that was of interest.
Taking all these thing that you had started to talk, let me ask you something interesting. You told about the people that don't want to show themselves. So, how does online self-presentation, such as the remain anonymous, affect user experience? Because I have heard about digital disinhibition also. Is
Mm.
there any connection with the subject?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anonymity doesn't necessarily have to translate into disinhibition. I think there's a sort of complex nexus between the individual's personality and individual characteristics combined with the technology. So the research that has kind of investigated the impact of anonymity in a very general sense. So lots of projects, for example, have kind of coded people's online interactions, existing online interactions in real online spaces, social media, blogs, what have you. Um, Comments on YouTube, comments on newspaper subsections of newspapers, where people can sometimes get quite heated and passionate about the topic. And researchers have compared anonymous um, comments versus comments from people that are identifiable, that actually have a name or a picture. Now, it's not always necessarily easy to determine whether that is the name and a picture of a real person, because as we discussed earlier, you could be using someone else's image. But I think for some of these data have been verified. What we tend to find is that it's not anonymity on its own that predicts kind of what we might refer to as disinhibited conduct. I think it's probably worth rewinding a little bit, because disinhibition doesn't necessarily have to just be negative. So when we talk about disinhibition, we refer to either benign disinhibition or toxic disinhibition. So toxic disinhibition is the more negative side of things. So, for example, being aggressive, trolling, bullying type behaviors, saying things that you wouldn't necessarily say to someone face to face, although in some cases people also say these things face to face as well. Whereas benign disinhibition is more neutral or sometimes positive. So, for example, there have been studies that have shown people can be more generous online. They might behave more altruistically when they're online, because it gives them the freedom to do that. So anonymity, if you have the mindset where you want to, be aggressive, or you have specific personality traits that might be associated with kind of more untoward behavior. So, for example, if you score high on the dark tetrad, so if you score high in psychopathy, or you score high in Machiavellianism, we tend to find that actually those traits themselves are more predictive of people's kind of online aggression or disinhibition than the kind of act of being anonymous. And that doesn't mean anonymity isn't important, because I think it is. It's the combination of sort of anonymity or potential anonymity, or what we might even think about as being perceived anonymity, in conjunction with the individual's kind of existing personality traits. And I think part of that is because people, whether or not they are anonymous, they might perceive themselves to be protected, because if you and I just, we're in different countries right now, right? So if
Yes.
I wanted to be horrible to you, which I wouldn't, obviously, because you're a lovely bloke and I wouldn't dream of being nasty. But if I wanted to be horrible to you, it's unlikely that you're going to then turn up at my front doorstep saying, "All right, Chris, let's have this out. Let's discuss this like men," or whatever. You're not going to do that. It's going to be a very expensive plane trip for you to come and sort that situation out. So I think there is the sort of there's the sense of feeling a sense of protection, because you might, someone could find you, I suppose, if they really wanted to, but the chances are no one's going to. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but the chances are that no one's going to. So I think it's the anonymity is less important than we think. I think when sort of Sulu was originally talking about online disinhibition, he thought that anonymity was very important, but the research tends to suggest that it's not as important. Actually, just kind of being behind the screen and feeling some sense of protection, because you might be geographically distanced, or you might, your location where you are might be unknown to the person. So even if they know who you are, your name, they aren't necessarily going to be able to track you down. So I think it's physical proximity that's more important than anonymity. But that's not to say that anonymity can't also have an impact. I think it can sometimes. But yeah, it's been
That
overplayed. I think anonymity's been overplayed.
unapplied, that interest. And I think in some way that let me try to ask. It's like, are certain personality types more prone to presenting themselves in authentic way online, and it's there are some possibles of and consequences about it.
Yeah, so in terms of being sort of authentic self, presenting yourself in a way that's more, when we talk about authentic, what we're referring to basically, because I mean, are we ever authentic? I mean, if we think about, say, Goffman's sort of conceptualization of self-presentation and the sort of analogy with the theatre and performance, that you know our sense of self is very malleable. The way we behave in one context might be very different from another. We do what we think is sometimes the right thing to do, um, based on what we think we're going to get out of that social situation, the rewards that we might receive from it. So we've all been in job interviews, and when you
Yes.
get asked certain questions like, "What are your most positive characteristics?" People don't always necessarily tell the truth. They say what they think the interviewer wants to hear, and that in itself could be classed as inauthentic. But there are certain aspects of your self-presentation which are authentic, that you can't really change very easily. The way that you come across, unless you're an exceptionally good actor, it's very difficult to kind of hide certain aspects of your, things like whether you're nervous or those reactions are much more difficult to conceal. But I guess by authentic, what we're referring to is, and again, using sort of Goffman's idea of the sort of theatrical, dramaturgical analogy, he talked about front of stage and backstage. So when we're kind of presenting the self, that's very much front of stage. Imagine you're an actor in the theatre, you've got a crowd, and you're presenting whatever that play is at that time. The audience have certain expectations of what they expect you to say and how they expect you to emote. Whereas the backstage would be the dressing room, where you can just sort of just relax and be yourself. So by authentic, I guess that's kind of what we're referring to, is how you might behave if there were no cameras or no scrutinous eyes on you at the moment. But yeah, we talked about self-concept clarity. That seems to be a big factor. So people that are more score higher in self-concept clarity, that have a clearer sense of their self, people that have higher self-esteem, they tend to be the individuals who are more likely to present themselves authentically. People that are essentially happy with themselves, people that are content with who they are. So we tend to find maybe certain personality traits also come across more authentically online. So, for example, extroversion tends to come across more authentically. And that might just be because the research shows that people that are extrovert tend to be happier or tend to have higher self-esteem, not necessarily happier, tend to have higher self-esteem than people who are more introvert. Um, Interestingly, I think a lot of our online behavior is there are certain aspects of our behavior that leak or betray certain aspects of our personality that we don't necessarily know that we're doing. Um, One of my former PhD students, Azar Eftekar, she did for a PhD. She was interested in self-presentation on Facebook, but she was particularly interested in a sort of more visual side of self-presentation. So the photos that people uploaded and the way in which they organized their kind of visual self-presentation online. So did they use lots of subfolders, or did they just throw all their photos into the single space? And she found that there were these clear and consistent and highly significant associations between personality traits and the ways in which people presented themselves online. So even in a space where there is some potential for people to be more expressive, to be more polished in their self-presentation, even if people want to do that, certain aspects of their personality might prevent them from doing it because they're just going to kind of go to their default place. So as an example, people who scored higher in conscientiousness. So, as you know, that's associated with being sort of self-disciplined and organized. They had, on average, significantly more photo albums than any other personality trait. So that their personality is being imprinted on the way in which they engage with the technology. So you could theoretically, and there are tools that allow you to do this. You could look at things like people's use of language, the way in which they engage with technology, and you can know about their personality before you even give them a personality test. And in some respects, sometimes these, using kind of tools to sort of sift through people's profiles and look at self-presentation can actually give you a more accurate um, idea about someone's personality than giving someone a personality test, because we know that when people take personality tests, they don't necessarily always don't always tell the truth. They sometimes might lie to themselves. People aren't always necessarily good at. Some people are better at others, but people aren't always good at introspecting. Aren't always good at kind of, well, who am I, or what is my reflecting on their behavior, on their motivations. It's not something that isn't that we do as a regular daily activity. So it's not always something that's easy to do. So yeah, I think there are certain aspects of technology that we use that kind of that our existing sense of who we are will be imprinted on the technology, but there are spaces where there's more room for negotiation, so to speak. So the issue with Facebook, or the issue with social media platforms, not all of them, but most of them, is that they are tied to the kind of offline world. So there's what we refer to as kind of anchored communication, because for the most part, the individuals that you're interacting with are people that you already know. So they have certain expectations about you. So the audience that have come to watch the play, if they're coming to watch Macbeth, they don't want to hear to be given Hamlet. And so people have expectations about who you are. So if you present something that's really kind of deviates massively from that, then people are going to be like, wait a minute, what's going on here? This isn't right. So it's anchored, but also there's some suggestion from that you get something called context collapse.
Yes.
Because you've got lots of people, there might not all necessarily be people that you would treat the same or behave in the same way around. But some of them might be your colleagues, some might be your close family members, some might be more distant family members, some might be people, some strangers, relatively, someone that you met down the pub one night when you were out. So, your relationship with these people is very different, but then you've got to present a kind of united front that they're all going to be happy with. And so you get this kind of context clash where actually you end up presenting something that's kind of doesn't really show any kind of extreme version of yourself. It's just something that appeals to the vast majority of individuals. And in fact, a few years ago, we looked at people's. This was back in the day when Facebook used to have about me sections. They don't really have them anymore. So you might remember this. I don't know if any of your students will be old enough to remember. But kind of in the earlier to sort of mid Facebook lifespan, Facebook looked a bit different than it does now. And one of the things that was quite prominent was what was called an about me section. And you get these on dating profiles as well. Again, depending upon the dating platform, it's just basically a free open space where you just write, who am I? You write about who you are. And people used to fill these in, and they used to put quite a lot of detail. They don't now, obviously, but they used to put a lot of detail. And so what we did is we conducted a sort of analysis, a textual analysis of the about me section versus the same individuals conversing in sort of online in a Facebook forum. So the same people, but communicating in different ways. And what we found was that the sort of communication style that people used in their about me section, which is something that's communicating to a lot of people all at once, was much more what we refer to as androgynous in its style. So we looked at sort of gender linked language, so typical masculine and feminine ways of communicating, because there are differences in how men and women will often use language. And we found that it sort of floated down the middle. Didn't really use any that were extreme in either way. Whereas on the forums, people are much more likely, the same individuals are much more likely to use more stereotypical gendered language. So there's something about presenting yourself to a larger potential audience of multiple different individuals from different backgrounds that kind of sort of brings your communication style to something that's kind of more amorphous, that's going to sort of capture a wider array of individuals rather than being too extreme. So yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect of online communication as well. Not sure whether that has how much of that has to do with well-being or mental health, but it's interesting.
That's is really interesting because we have a new generation that's all linked to the devices all the time at the internet, and we have these new metaverses that will be being developed like Roblox and others.
Yes.
And to think in this way, because when we are using some way to talk like Facebook and other platform to be connected to others, we are in a 2D way to interact. But when we use something like Roblox and another way, like the metaverse is coming, the way to interact it's much more uh, profound, and in some way we have some
Yes.
embodiment of avatars, embodiment of characters. And I want
Yes.
to ask
Interesting.
you two things, because I know the problems like psychoanalyst. Talk a lot about this kind of to view to construct your identity. But do you think that there are psychological benefits to virtual embodiment? For example, those embodying on avatar or character in virtual worlds or video games could offer therapeutic advantages and the impact in the mind. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there are benefits potentially. I mean, I'm not sure whether your students would have come across this, but it's a fairly well-known sort of phenomenon in cyberpsychology, something called the Proteus effect.
Yes.
So it's named after a Greek god, I believe, who was capable of kind of shape shifting and changing their form. So that's where the kind of the name for the effect comes from. What the effect demonstrates is that, at least for the short term, because it's very difficult to kind of measure long-term benefits because no one's really done any kind of longitudinal studies, but at least in the short term, embodying a character, an avatar, or a video game, doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to be virtual embodiment. It don't have to be, within a virtual world or within virtual reality. This can just be playing as a character in a video game. We find that when people play as characters that are taller or have what might be stereotypically more attractive qualities, physically attractive qualities, compared to people that play as or embody characters or avatars that are shorter in height or may be associated with having less physically attractive qualities. When they come out, so there's two things that happen. Within the virtual world or the game, their behavior changes. So this has been measured in a variety of different games or different online experiences. But we find that within the game, they might, if they're playing as an attractive avatar, for example, they might be more flirtatious, or they might behave in a more confident way, which might be demonstrated in a variety of different ways. I'll talk about some research we've done recently, which kind of which highlights this quite nicely. But that's fine. You might go, well, that's just role play. That's priming. They've been primed to behave in that way by being given a character that has a certain physical kind of characteristics. Of course, they might associate those characteristics with certain behaviors, so they're just engaging in the game, in the virtual experience in a way that matches onto that because it makes sense. So they're using kind of any stereotypical associations that they've built up, schemas that they've developed over the years, observing, for example, that more attractive people tend to be more confident and less attractive people tend to be less confident, or what have you. That's fine. The really interesting bit is what happens after. So when you bring them out of the virtual experience or the video game, we find that then, and this has been tested in a variety of different ways, most commonly through what's called a sort of economic game. So they get the participants to, after they've played in the video game or the virtual world, to come sit down opposite another participant, or at least they're led to believe that it's another participant. It's usually a stooge, a confederate, someone who is given a kind of scripted response to make. And then they take part in this economic game in which they have to negotiate over a kind of fictional pot of money. And the aim of the game is to get as much of the share as you can, so a higher percentage of the share as you possibly can, but nobody gets anything if the other person doesn't agree. So you're going to try and push for more for yourself, but if you push it too far, like I want 90%, if the person says no, no one gets anything, right? So what we find is that participants who played as or embodied the more attractive or the taller avatar always ask for a significantly larger pot of share of the money than participants who played as the less attractive or shorter avatar or shorter character. So, it's not just impacting on their behavior within the game. It's having sort of a bleed effect where it's impacting on their behavior after they've exited the game, after they've left the virtual environment, which is really interesting. Why is that happening? One of the sort of most prominent theories that's used to describe this effect is self-perception theory. And there's a lot of evidence in support of this theory. The idea is that we kind of evaluate who we are based not just upon just sort of random rumination, but based on thinking about what we've done and how we've behaved in different contexts. So we kind of, we will go out into the world, we will engage with people, we'll interact with people. And then as a consequence of that, so I'm just muting a chat here, we will then think about what that means and what that means about who we are. Because sometimes we might surprise ourselves. You often see kind of news stories about acts of heroism where someone run into a burning building, and then when they interview them after, they'll say, well, I never knew I had it in me, or what have you. So sometimes we'll do things that we didn't necessarily expect. And so self-perception theory is about how we think about or ruminate on those behaviors, and then that rumination then tells us something about who we are. So the idea, I guess, is that people are behaving in this way, and at some part of that behavior of the avatar is being kind of internalized in some respects. So even if it's only for a short period of time, it's making the person feel more confident, which is really interesting. So we can, and this paper is currently about to be, it's been accepted for publication, so it's about to go in press. We looked at this effect using the video game The Sims.
Yes.
Some
I
very
played a
popular
lot.
franchise. Yeah, I did as well. Not so much nowadays, but yeah, it's a very popular game. Basically, you get to design a character, and then you live in a kind of virtual world, and you can do whatever you want. You can just be a slob and sit around your house doing nothing, or you can go out and be ambitious and get a good job, and etc. So we created a kind of a house with all of the fixtures and fittings. So it had a gym, and it had the pool. So it had the stuff that you can use if you want to improve yourself. It also had the stuff that that you can use if you just want to sit around kind of being more snobbish, like TV and video games and things like that. And it had housemates. We had housemates in there that kind of differed in terms of their level of attractiveness and height and all that kind of stuff. And then we created two characters, and we piloted these. So we created loads of characters, and then we got participants to rate them. And we chose the one that they rated as consistently the most attractive, and the one that they rated as consistently the least attractive. And then participants were randomly assigned to it. They didn't know that there were other participants doing different things. They were randomly assigned to either one or the other. And then they were just told, just play the game. They were given a free play session to do whatever they wanted. What we did that was slightly different is that we also thought it would be interesting to see if there were any differences between neurotypical individuals and autistic people, because there's a lot of research with autism which suggests that the people who have autism might find it more difficult to take someone else's perspective. So the whole kind of theory of mind debate that's been going on for years and years. So on the one hand, you might expect people with autism to be less likely to experience a Proteus effect because they might find it more difficult to put themselves in that character's shoes. However, from what I understand of the research area, is that this effect, in terms of perspective taking, autistic people find it easier to do that with kind of fictional characters than real people, maybe because their fictional characters are a little bit more one-dimensional than real people. So we included that as a variable in the investigation as well. And we did two different things. First of all, we measured what they did while they were playing the game. So did they gravitate towards the more sort of self-improvement type activities like going to the gym and things like that, or did they gravitate to the more sort of slobbier activities? Yes. And how did they interact with the other characters, the NPCs, the non-playable characters? Were they nice to them? Did they flirt with them? And then after they finished playing in the game, they participated in the economic game in the same way that they do in most of these studies. And there are normally 4 rounds. The first round, the participant gets to say what share they want. In the second round, the Confederate offers a fair split, 50-50, and they either accept or reject. In the third round, the participant again gets to make their offer. And in the last round, the Confederate offers an unfair split. So they say 75-25, and again, accept, reject as their options. What we found was that we're kind of within the game itself, irrespective of whether the participant was neurotypical or they were an individual with autism, they all behaved more confidently within the game. So, and they all also behaved in more stereotypical ways. So the attractive avatars, whoever was playing as them, they tended to be more likely to flirt, tended to be more likely to initiate interactions, tend to be more likely to kind of do gym type activities. And the players playing as the less attractive avatar did the opposite. They're more likely to sort of play video games, less likely to flirt and things like that. And in terms of the economic gain, we found that, again, irrespective of the participant, so whether they were neurotypical or autistic, that they asked for significantly more money, so significantly larger share of the pot. So I think that's quite exciting because that has, I think, ramifications, potential applications in terms of things like, we know, for example, that autistic people tend to have poorer self-esteem.
Yes.
And a lot of that's obviously to do with kind of navigating life as someone with autism. It's not easy, and that can be in some of that interaction, or those difficulties, those complications can be internalized. So there are potentially, from a therapeutic perspective, there's the using video games as a way to support people's positive mental health, to support their self-esteem. And it's not a hard sell, because actually what we find is that autistic people gravitate towards video games. They are, I'm not sure the reasons why, but you tend to find that, actually, comparatively speaking. So if you compare a group of people with autism versus a neurotypical group, you will find that people with autism are much more likely to play video games, much more likely to be interested in video games, disproportionately so. So again, so it's an environment in which they enjoy being in. It's a hobby that they already have potentially. So you can leverage that, and use that as a way to support people to have a more positive view of the self, via their interactions with these different avatars. So I think we're looking to expand that research. So we originally started that project a long time ago. We started it during COVID and had to sit on the back burner for a long time. But now that we've got this published, the plan is that we're going to start looking at more kind of longitudinal approaches, see if there are some potential positive impacts on people's lives.
That it's awesome because it's really, really linked to my research, because I'm researching here in Paris the transhumanism and the red modifications of the self when we are augmented human. And our schema corporal schema is much more than the biological body or the mind, because it's not separated. When Freud developed the ego or self is at the first time all spread in the body. So if our body is a pulsional body, so a drive body that we have an energy to be connected to everything, very psychoanalytical, I know that. Yes. So when we are are playing some video game or using an avatar, so our self can be reconfigured or can be changed. So our perception of who we are or can be really, really touched. So
and it happens almost automatically. It happens much more easily than you would imagine. People accept changes, much more readily than you would think. A really good example of this is doing something like a virtual body swap. So it's really funky technology, but it's really cool. So you can design the sort of virtual interface in such a way that if you and I both had a headset, you can do it in such a way that if you put on the headset and I put on a headset, when I look down, I'm actually looking at your body, your arms. You start moving, and that's what I'm seeing. And vice versa. That when you're looking through your headset, you're seeing life through my eyes, right, rather than through your own eyes. And this limited amount of research which has looked at the sort of benefits or therapeutic potential of this technology, but they have looked at the potential for people to change attitudes, for example, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the really fascinating thing is that at first it's a little disorienting. Obviously, when you're going, oh God, what's going on here? I'm not. This isn't what I'm used to seeing. But people adapt remarkably quickly to the point where actually, if you've got the headset on and you're seeing life through my eyes, if I went and touched, you're seeing the hand, remember, so you kind of getting to the point where it's becoming like it's your own hand. Your brain starts to think it's your own hand, right? If I went and touched something hot, it actually gets to the point where people feel like they're sensing that, they're feeling that sensation, and they want to move their hand away. So, it's this isn't something that just happens. Your brain wants to make sense of the world, right? And a lot of that happens automatically without you being consciously aware that it's going on. A good example of this, I think, is something called the McGurk effect. Have you come across the McGurk effect? So with the McGurk effect, what we find is that when you have competing or stimuli that don't match, they're not congruous, your brain tries to make sense of it. So the McGurk effect is, so if you see someone's lip movements are making or seem to be making a certain sound, and we can tell that via the way the lips move. So if I do a V sound, you can sort of see with the way that my lips and my teeth are being used that that's the sound I'm making. In the McGurk effect, they have the lips making one sound, but actually what you hear is a different sound. Now, what happens there? You'd think that you would just hear the sound that's being played, right? But you don't. You hear the sound that the lips are making, right? And you can't help yourself. Even when you know that you're being tricked, you can't stop it from happening. So so a part of your brain, has evolved to essentially prioritize the visual channel. That's more important. What you see is more important than what you hear. Sorry, I keep getting beeps in the background. What you see is more important than what you hear. And so, it just takes over. And it doesn't matter that that that's not true, that that you're being misled. Your brain will just do the work. And I think it's the same happens in things like these virtual body swaps, that at first it's a bit odd, but then eventually, you part of your brain wants to make sense of this, and so it does. And it doesn't matter whether you fight against it, it just makes sense of it. And very quickly it feels like it's your own body, even though it's not. And it's not your own body, but it feels like it. I think they've done similar studies where they kind of have a mirror in someone's hand behind the mirror, but on the other side they have like a plastic hand, and
Yes,
then
yes, yes.
they touch it and they feel like they're being touched. So your brain, conscious awareness, and actually the sort of more primordial parts of your brain are kind of not necessarily always working in harmony. And in terms of the sort of virtual body swapping, that's been used principally to try and change people's attitudes. So, for example, they found that when people that might score high on kind of like intolerance sort of factors or intolerance scales, or people that might have more racist attitudes, when they've put them on the goggles, and then they're seeing themselves through the body of someone that they would normally have quite negative perspectives about, it can have these sort of transformative effects in terms of changing, or at least in the short term, having changing those attitudes. So it can be quite powerful. I'm surprised this kind of technology isn't used more regularly for these kind of purposes, because it can have some really transformative impacts on people in terms of their attitudes. So I'm not sure I can't even remember what your initial question was, but actually I've gone off
Yes,
on a
yes.
tangent again.
Yeah, it's very, very linked. So it's interesting because I can see the way that the cyber psychology is nowadays, because it's inter linked with all these subjects, and it's not only about the psychology or the technology, and the relationship into the human and the machine and this new technology is something that make us to develop and to study much more, and getting this to the way the psychologists can work. Like after the pandemic, we have a lot of discussions about using like technology to therapists. So what about technology-mediated communication tools, such as video calls in therapy? Because what is your opinion? Why some therapists resist adopting these tools yet? Because we know that nowadays we are in a different situation in reality.
Yeah, from what I understand, and I'm not a therapist, but I've worked with counselling psychologists, taught on counselling psychology programs, but not about counselling psychology, about things like technology. And from kind of this might be more anecdotal. This is based on discussions I've had with people that work in this space, not necessarily kind of research informed. So you might want to take this with a little bit of a pinch of salt. But my discussions that I've had suggest that one reason why some people, and I wouldn't necessarily think it's the majority, but I think more therapists prefer to do things face to face than in a technology mediated context. The people that are opposed to the use of the technology, the main reason is that they don't think that they can build a rapport with the person as easily via the technology as they can face to face, and that also includes things like being able to read what into their body language and their behavior. They find it harder to get a sense of the person, to get a feel for who they are, and I can kind of understand that. A lot of my PhD work actually many years ago, when video sort of tools like this first started coming about, I looked at how, I mean, at the start, I was just interested in whether there would be any differences. I didn't know necessarily what direction those differences would go in because this technology was brand new, but I was interested in whether using video conferencing or video links like this impacted on communication dynamics, and if it impacted on things like person perception. So do we perceive the person differently as a consequence of interacting with them via video link compared to interacting with them face to face? And I investigated this in a few different contexts, like a job interview context, a sort of courtroom context. And what I found was that people's perceptions or judgments about another individual tended to be more negative via a video link. So we tend to be more likely, not always, but more likely to have a favorable, positive view of someone if we're interacting with them face to face, and a less positive perspective about someone if we're interacting with them via video link. So, putting this into sort of into context, what it might suggest is that if you're the only person being interviewed via a video link, you're going to be less likely to get the job than if all the other people are being interviewed face to face. Not always, obviously. Sometimes some people are very good at kind of using this technology and are very good at using it in a way to present themselves positively. It's much harder to do it, and I think
Yes.
a big part of that is about the communication of non-verbal information. So you can't reach out and touch someone. You don't have that physical co-present environment that you can both orient towards. You can't pick up subtle cues like posture and the way you incline your body. All of these things that might communicate important information, like whether you like somebody, whether you're warming to them. Things like eye contact to disrupt it. It's much harder to make eye contact. So now I'm looking at the camera, so it looks like I'm kind of looking at you, but actually I'm not. I'm not. I'm looking at a camera on the screen. So it looks, even though it might appear to you that we're making eye contact, we're clearly not. And I can't see you at all now because my focus is on the camera. So it's not very satisfactory in that respect. So I think that's my hunch, is that a big part of the reason why people don't like the technology is because they feel that it's harder to build a rapport. It's harder to get a feel for them, to get a sense of their motivations and their inclinations. And I think there is some truth in that, because we do use, all variety of different communication cues to make judgments and inferences about someone, and that includes, non-verbal as well as verbal information. And if in some way that information is distorted or it's missing, then that can have an impact on communication. But I think at the same time, it's worth acknowledging that from the sort of from the client's perspective, actually, the technology can be a good thing, not only from the sense that it might mean that they would be more likely to go into therapy because there might be factors that prevent them from leaving the house or make them less inclined to want to leave the house. It increases the sort of accessibility of therapy, cuts down the costs associated with going into therapy, particularly if you live in kind of more remote places. And also, we talked earlier about disinhibition. I think, you might
Yes.
find that certain people are more likely to open up and talk about more intimate things if they're in a more mediated sort of communication context. But even better if it was because this is actually what we're doing now is not too dissimilar from face to face. If you did it text or audio only, you might find that people would feel less pressured, feel less concerned about how others might be perceiving them and judging them. Because when we're talking about things that make us appear vulnerable,
Yes.
we're more likely to be worried about what someone else thinks about us, and that might be heightened if you can see those physical reactions. So if you're looking uncomfortable, if you're shifting around, or your face is turning red, that might then shut down communication, because you draw back because you're concerned about how others might be thinking about that, whether even in a safe space, where the therapist is non-judgmental, those reactions might occur nonetheless, particularly if they're about things that are really sensitive to people. So I think that's my take. I think that
Yes.
the technology has a lot of potential, and not just when we're in the middle of a pandemic, because obviously that it creates opportunities that would be almost impossible to have otherwise. But I think it has potential for other reasons, particularly
Yes.
from the client's perspective.
Yes, I think that the pandemic only make something that was in development only to get faster, because the technology really are being developed in this reality and life all connected. And one thing interesting, because you said that uh, about the client's patient's perspective. Uh, yes, in psychoanalysis, the all the time we're talked about the setting that we have to make the transference and counter-transference, this feeling. But it has been well documented that virtual reality in particularly effective in treating phobias
Yes.
or anxiety related conditions can be very thing good. So, how do you see the therapeutic potential of the virtual reality to the clinic nowadays?
I think virtual reality, I think we're only really at the tip of the iceberg of what virtual reality can be used for, particularly given some of the things that I was talking about earlier in terms of how virtual embodiment might have positive impacts on people's sense of self-esteem, self-worth, and so on. But for the vast majority of the literature, which focuses on sort of therapy and virtual reality, focuses on virtual reality exposure therapy. That seems to be principally what the technology is being used for currently in terms of its therapeutic potential. So, as you say, treating phobias, treating PTSD, for example. So putting people into a position and where they might be exposed to something that might be fearful or might create a negative response, and then sort of gradual exposure to those stimuli, which can be done very easily or much more straightforwardly via virtual reality, because it's harder to, if you, it depends upon what you're afraid of, obviously, but if you want to gradually expose people to their fear stimulus, then it might be difficult to find safe environments out in the real world where those things exist. Actually, you're contending with other factors as well, like other people that might be sitting and looking on and interfering when they shouldn't. Whereas if you can do it within the confines of an office space, behind locked door, you can use virtual reality that kind of negates all of those other potential disruptive factors and brings people into the moment. And what they see within the virtual environment can be upscaled, so they can you can start off with mild, not less threatening stimuli and work your way up to things that are more threatening and potentially more concerning and likely to lead to a more intense response. But I guess the really interesting thing about virtual reality in terms of why it tends to work very well isn't just the fact that it's that you can have greater control over the stimuli and that you don't have to go out into the wild, so to speak. But there's also something about being immersed within virtual reality which actually kind of creates a response that's very similar to what the response you would get if it was the real stimulus in the outside, in the real world, in the outside world. So if you put somebody into a virtual reality environment and you get them to kind of walk to, let's say that environment they're up on a mountain, and you get them to walk to the edge of the mountain, look over, it's going to feel like the brain is going to react to that like that's really happening. Even though it's not, you still get that fear response, that reaction still occurs. And I think the kind of immersive nature of virtual reality is much more effective than, say, if I was using other stimuli like playing video clips or showing some photograph, or if it was a spider they're afraid of, for example, having a model of a spider or what have you. Virtual reality is actually much more immersive than those, because it takes all of your senses, and it makes you feel like you're actually there. And I think that can potentially be very powerful in terms of kind of treating these different types of conditions, if it's used in the right way. But I think there's only a very select number of therapists that utilize virtual reality in this fashion, because as well as being an expert in therapy, you also got to understand how to use technology, and there's a steep learning curve, and it comes at a cost. It's expensive. It's expensive to run, expensive to buy, to update. It's expensive to keep having the latest tech, getting the right stimuli programmed into the virtual environments, so on. So I think I tend to find that there are specialist centres, usually in the United States. I don't think they have many of these in Europe. From my understanding, most of the sort of specialist virtual reality therapies are occurring in the US, particularly on the west coast of the US. So it's a very localized kind of economy. But I think there is the potential there that's really untapped. It hasn't been used as effectively as it might have done. And I think we will start to discover, the more that academics and therapists and practitioners become aware of this technology, they will start to experiment with it, and it will start to be utilized in other therapeutic contexts as well. I remember there was a cool, someone designed a really cool, just as an example, someone designed a really cool sort of virtual reality program that sort of simulated sort of eye gaze. So it was really simple. When you were kind of within the virtual environment, you were walking through a subway station, and as you looked at people and turned around at them, they looked up at you. and their heads oriented towards you. So you could sense the program would sense the direction in which you're looking, and then people would look at you. And so that, they were using this to sort of support people that had problems with things like social anxiety, that found it difficult, to go out and about because they were worried about how other people were perceiving them, and they're worried that all eyes were upon them. So yeah, in that kind of safe environment, you can support people to overcome these worries and overcome these fears.
That it's a endless subject
Yeah,
because
it's a brave
to
new
me,
world.
yes, I like spend all the day talking about this subject, but we have to talk much more, Professor. But I only really want to thank you a lot to all this class, to so much knowledge that could help, that can help a lot all my students. So thank you a lot.
My pleasure. And if any of your students ever want to learn more, or they're interested in any of my research, feel free to send me an email. I'm sure you can let them know how to contact me, and I'd be delighted to reply to them. Although, academics are very busy, so if they don't get a reply straight away, but bear with me, I will reply to them at some point, I promise.